Right, thank you everybody for coming along to tonight's event, the second in a series entitled To Build a Home, looking at this post-war redevelopment of cities in Britain. Tonight is a round table discussion and it's born out of the Walkley Ways, Walkley Wars community history project, supported by the Heritage Lottery Fund, we always have to say that. And the project is looking at three key periods in the 20th century history of Walkley. It is a co-produced community history project, one where the research and writing of the history is undertaken by people who live or work in the suburb, with mentoring and training from historians, designers, writers, etc. Tonight we will be looking at one of the most crucial periods in determining what Walkley is like today as a thriving suburb of Sheffield. The late 60s to early 1970s was a fulcrum of change in national housing policy, and Walkley was on the front line. Walkley Ways has recorded oral history interviews and collected archive photographs from this period. The photographs you see now are some of the ones we've collected, which show either a personal set of photographs during demolition or just pre-demolition to part of Walkley, or city surveyors' photographs when they were assessing which houses would survive and which houses would be demolished during the improvement phase. We basically thought this was a very crucial period to record because the 1970s is already a very different world. Things have changed very dramatically from the 1970s. No internet then, no supermarkets, low car ownership at the time, no mobile phones. A very different world to live in. And it's a world that already the students who were living in Walkley at the time are retired. So it's a sort of history that we need to record fairly soon before it sort of disappears forever from the personal point of view of the people who lived in Walkley through this period, the people who made Walkley a thriving, vibrant suburb in the 50s and 60s, the suburb that was to be demolished, the people who lived through slum clearance, the people who campaigned against it, and then the people who sort of occupied the houses as they improved. So tonight we will hear about a period which begins with wholesale council redevelopment and slum clearance in the 1960s, progresses via the Walkley Action Group grassroots campaign against demolition, and ends with a change of council policy in favour of improvement of housing and the wider environment rather than wholesale redevelopment. What happened at this time in Walkley is set in the context of change in national policy, and as the first general improvement area in Sheffield, it went on to impact on the wider city, through the way the council engaged with communities during housing and through the approach the council had to housing policy. It helped move the council from top-down planning to a more consultation approach. Our three speakers have been brought here tonight because in different ways they were key in shaping modern Walkley and then elsewhere in Sheffield, through changing the council's housing policy first in the suburb from one of clearance to one of improvements, and then elsewhere in the city as well. This is the second time the roundtable has been convened. The first time was last year in Walkley, so we're bringing the suburb down into the city for tonight. So the three speakers we have are not really speakers. This is hopefully going to be more of a discursive night, so they're going to give very short presentations about the period, about their roles, and basically we're going to open up the floor to yourselves, so hopefully you will be able to sort of ask questions about the period through three people who were very instrumental in that period. Jeff, on the far right, was a university researcher in politics at the time, with a strong belief in the potential for research to impact on wider society. He helped found the Walkley Action Group, and in 1982 he became the Officer for Social Strategy in the city. Veronica was elected as a Labour councillor for Walkley in 1971. She sat on the Housing Committee, so very influential in what we're talking about tonight, until 1978, and was chair of the school subcommittee during that period. Narendra was Assistant Principal Planning Officer from 1971, with responsibility for inner city action zones, of which Walkley was one. From 1974, he was Assistant Chief Planner, and then between 1983 and 1987, he was Chief Planner for the city. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the first of tonight's contributors, Jeff.
Thank you. Do I need a mic or can you hear me okay? You can. So for me, the events of nearly 50 years ago provided me with a personal journey that has shaped my life and work. And there were three formative influences, which I think were formative on the process that we're going to discuss tonight, but also on my life. First was the downside, really, of modernist architecture. The previous session to this one, I think, concentrated on that. I moved to go to university from a small town, Skegness, population 13,000, to a big city, Glasgow, population at the time nearly 1 million. And in my final year, I lived in a tenement block and overlooked the building of the Red Road flats. They are currently being demolished, and at the time, they were the highest buildings in Europe, 31 stories. When I moved to Sheffield to be a research associate in the politics department, I was faced every day in my journey with a prospect of the Kelvin development, which was begun a little later in '67 and demolished in 1994, I think it was. A critique of these large modernist developments was made by a colleague of mine in the Conference of Socialist Economists, describing the problems with the Hume development, concrete again, in Manchester. And for the first time, I think, there was a socialist criticism of what had become a socialist project, if you like. We can talk about that later. The second formative influence was really my post at Sheffield University with Bill Hampton and Bernard Crick, which produced in the end a book called Community and Politics. And they persuaded me, and it was part of the research, of the limitations but also the possibilities of local government. Some of you will be familiar with the Beveridge report, which helped found the welfare state in our country. He described 5 giant evils. If I can get them correct, they were disease, there was squalor, there was ignorance, I think you know. There were 2 others, want and disease. So, what was interesting in that period, and we had a brief discussion prior to this meeting, was that local authorities took responsibility, really, for addressing ignorance with control of the local education system, but also very substantially the housing that would replace the slums. So, local authorities played a key role, and, as I think Veronica will elaborate, the Skeffington report, as well as the kind of work that Bill Hampton was doing, indicated that alongside local authorities, we could have community activism. It didn't really happen before then, but I think it was a precursor to the work that we were able to do. And the third formative influence for me was obviously working in a university, and as Bill said in his introduction, wanting the research and the intellect, the discipline that academics could provide, wanting that not simply to understand the world in Marxist terms, but to change it. So utilising that intelligence in order to shape policy and politics. So those were the 3 formative influences on me. I think others will talk more substantially about the Walkley Action Group. For me, there were just, well, let us say, 4 or 5 bullet points. I was a young, raw and relatively arrogant person, 24, stood for the local election in 1969. Labour had lost the election for the first time since 1929, in 1968, so things were on a knife edge. And with the support of local residents, but also crucially a lot of students, we were able to get about 700, 800 votes, where the Labour majority was only 5, if I recall. So I think this was time for the local authority, dominated by some very good men, I say men, but also women, Enid Hattersley, Harold Lambert, Jim Sterland, so Ron Ironmonger, who was leader, to persuade them really that we were a fighting force. So The election was, I think, quite salutary. The public meetings that Narendra will describe in a moment or two, 400 people, 500 people, very clear that what they wanted for Upper Walkley, the better houses, was to retain them and improve them. And for Lower Walkley, which Veronica will talk about, I know, to secure a slum clearance process that was efficient and dynamic and humane, rather than the 4 or 5 years that often it took to clear the slums in a particular street or district. We visited, as Veronica did, many people who were there isolated after 4 or 5 years because they refused to go into Kelvin and they wanted to go into Wisewood, which was a kind of semi-detached house up in Hillsborough. So that was a very problematic and fiercely negative experience for very many people. And although Walkley Action Group tended to concentrate on Upper Walkley, on improving the housing, we did have one arm of it, and this was reported in a publication we produced with student community action called Slow Death to Slum. We set up the group. I think we were pretty influential, as my colleagues will say. These action groups spread like wildfire. They spread to the inner city areas of the better terraced houses. Netherthorpe in Pond, Burngreen, Darnall, Healy, Sharrow, all those inner city areas that you as students, many of you, will now live in. These were houses scheduled for demolition. These are houses that we refurbished and improved somewhat. I know I've been to some of the houses recently and they're pretty squalid, if you would. But broadly speaking, they've been maintained. And the area I live in, Broom Hall, was saved from the bulldozers by Narendra and others in the 1970s. So it spread like wildfire. It was a new phase of community action, particularly of urban community action. And I'll hand over now to my colleagues.
Right, and now, Veronica, please.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Jeff. Yes, as Jeff said, there was a big upheaval politically in Sheffield in 1968. I'd just become involved in the Labour Party, mainly I needed something interesting to do because I'd just stopped work with small babies. And I'd always been on the left and decided that despite their attitude to Europe, with which I profoundly disagreed at that time, you're just got to get in there and join them and persuade them. But anyway, I was very much involved in going and helping in these marginal wards that had been lost in 1968. I lived on one side of Rivlin Valley on Stannington Road, so Walkley was my nearest marginal ward to go and work in. And I also did some work in Netherthorpe with Mrs. Hattersley, Roy's mother, who's been referred to. And I have to say, I had not realised just how poor a lot of the housing in Walkley was, and indeed in other parts of Sheffield. The number of homes where they were very, very small, very tightly packed together, no inside sanitation. If they were lucky, they had actually got a pot sink and a cold tap. But there were still some people that had to use a pump in the yard. And many of the housing conditions were very, very poor indeed. And as I went round and was talking to people, and as has been mentioned, the huge Kelvin flats, similar to Park Hill, but down in the Don Valley along Infirmary Road, they were very anxious about going to live there. And they wanted something that was of a scale where they would feel at home, where they would feel that they would know their neighbours. The communities were very closely knit. I know there were some communities and streets in Netherthorpe where they did all move together to Kelvin, but by the time Lower Walkley was being cleared, Kelvin was full, and there would just be odd flats coming up. And there was this big anxiety about being torn out of their if you like, their community. I found it very surprising going and talking to people who lived between not Infirmary Road, Lancet Road and Penistone Road, those streets, Burton Street and Bumford Street. Many of them, quite elderly in their 70s, had actually either been born in that house or just round the corner. They had always lived there, and hence the great attraction of Wisewood, which has been mentioned, which was not too far up the road, or possibly Stannington. The big problem there was that the people who lived on Wisewood and Stannington had no intention whatever of moving until they were carried out. People had waited for a very long time. So there was quite a difficult situation in terms of meeting the aspirations and housing needs of the people. And as I got involved with knocking on doors, and I'd been made aware by going to local government courses run by Professor Hampton, who's also been mentioned, who talked a bit about this situation. So I'd heard about Jeff, and particularly when he came so close to winning the seat after we'd lost the previous year. And then I was asked if I would be the candidate in 1971. It was clearly necessary to go and talk to him and persuade him that I would be more use in the Labour group than he would be if he were elected as an independent member. And I have to say that members of the Labour group of the time were very supportive and helpful. Things were beginning to change in the attitude towards slum clearance has been mentioned. There had been the 1969 Housing Act, which enabled councils to give grants for improvement, which was a big step forward. And Walkley was being looked at as a possible place where this would happen. And I spent a lot of time during that campaign knocking on the doors in central Walkley, and I particularly remember Freedom Road, where we could knock on one door and they'd say, I'll vote for you if you can guarantee my house stays up. And next door, they'd say, get me out of this place. If you can promise me you'll get me rehoused, I'll vote for you. So, because there was a huge mixture of housing, unlike Lower Walkley, where almost uniformly the properties were very small, had very few, if any, amenities, and were mainly owned by slum landlords who had no intention whatever of ever doing any repairs if they could get away with it. Quite a lot of houses within the central area of Walkley had been bought, often by sitting tenants, which they had the opportunity to do in those days. And they put a lot of effort into it. There were still quite a few that had been quite neglected. And in between some of the really quite good solid houses, there were areas of housing, little rows, which were terrible. And if you walk around Walkley, you will see in that central area little green spaces here and there. New flats and bungalows, one-bedroom flats and bungalows, because that was one of the greatest needs in rehousing people from the slum clearance area lower down. Some off-street parking, and then eventually, a place very dear to my heart, Ruskin Park. I'm actually still, after some 12 years or so, chair of Friends, no, longer than that, 14 years, chair of Friends of Ruskin Park. It's on a big fun day every year. The next one's on the 21st of June. I'll put that on one side. But the fact that in an area which was uniformly black, these new green areas were developing over those years, new housing, and among the whole point of being able to give grants, and in an improvement area 75% grants, meant that people not only got new bathrooms, new kitchens, possibly central heating, money to put a dormer window in the attic to make it into a usable bedroom. There was also a grant which I discovered when I was looking through the work I did for the history project on that area, going through old council minutes, the grants for cleaning the front of your house. And after a few years, you suddenly began to see which of the houses were red brick and which of them were actually rather nice honey-coloured stone. In 1970, you couldn't tell. You just saw black as you looked down the road. So, having done a lot of talking to people in Walkley Action Group and talking to colleagues as I started to attend meetings of the Labour group, people were ready to listen. And I think one of the things that is very different from now in terms of local government is that local government could do things. They had financial freedoms. If they wanted to put the rates up by 36%, which my husband did at one time in the 80s when he was chair of the budget, you could do so. All the limitations on how much you could put up local taxation and the reductions in government grants came later. But at that time, we used to be able to plan. Each year for the budget, it wasn't a case of going through we've got to cut X million off, what's the least bad cut we can make this year in this area and that area and the other area, but how can we make things better? What new schools are we going to build? Which other schools are we going to modernise, in addition to everything that was going on in housing? And the people who'd actually been in power for a long time, I think were a bit shaken up by having lost for a year, and were determined not to let it happen again. And that also helped a lot, I think, in terms of responsiveness to what people were asking for. And gradually, over those years, once the first improvement area, and I've got it in the December 1971 council minutes, the National Building Agency, which had been brought in to look at the area and see what could be done, they said, yes, this area can be improved. Some houses will still need to be taken out, but overall we can do it. And eventually the first general improvement area was in fact declared, and then 2 further general improvement areas to cover the whole of that central area of Walkley, below South Road, Howard Road, down to White House Road and Walkley Road. And I'm sure Narendra will tell you quite a lot more, but there were a lot of environmental improvements to the area as well, like tree planting in addition to the off-street parking, green spaces which are declared. But simultaneously, further down the road, the new Lancet estate was being developed, which is 2-storey family houses, 1-bedroom bungalows and flats, some 2-bedroom flats, because obviously there are some families that need flats and more than 1 bedroom, with lots of, again, of new green open space. Further down the hill, I referred to Burton Street and Bamford Street. There was a real problem getting those people rehoused, and their conditions were getting worse and worse. And we had a new estate opening up at Longley Farm, which was within a few weeks of being able to let the first dwellings. And I said to the housing manager, these people are very worried about being scattered everywhere. Can we not take them over to the new estate and see how many of them would like to be rehoused together? And we laid on several buses, went over, and indeed very many of the people did decide to do that. So there was some imagination going on as well to make things more responsive to people's needs. And as a result, Walkley has remained a very popular area to live. It's still got a very thriving community. The shops have been a bit affected by just down the road, Morrison's at one end and Tesco at the other end, quite good shops just up the hill in Cooks. But many of them are hanging in there, and Beaches set up a Walkley farm shop to try and maintain this village atmosphere. And I feel very, very privileged to have been part of helping these developments to happen, to keep Walkley as a really vibrant place to live. I moved out of Sheffield in '78, which is why I came. But when I moved back, I made sure I moved into Walkley itself, and then much later on, a few years ago actually, went back onto the council for a bit representing Walkley because it is an area that I really care about and hope to see continue to flourish.
Thank you. And now, Narendra.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy. Thanks, Bill. Right, where did I arrive on the scene as a young lad? 1971. In charge of design and environmental improvements. My first christening of what the public has to say was the 1972 public meeting referred to earlier on. There were 450 people in the Walkley Church Hall. There were all the top politicians there, Alderman Lambert, Alderman Sterling, Bernard Warren, Dick Officer and architect, Roland Adamson, and I was a junior at the back. And the impact it had on me, that particular public meeting, I only made one statement throughout the evening, having listened to what they were saying. We've heard what you've said, let's just take it back, your strength of feeling, and we'll get back to you. And that was all I had said. And he struck a chord with the secretary of the Walkley Action Group at the time. No, he was the chairman, wasn't he?
Mrs. Collett was
Mrs. Collett. She confirmed in writing next day to me. So the first public meeting clearly showed to me, you don't take people lightly. Listen what they're saying. They may not be able to get everything they want, but that was a very important lesson for me. Clearly, coming back at the ranch, as Jeff said earlier on, there was a movement nationally that there is a lot of top-down approach. Everything is coming from the top, and the local people are not being listened to. They are being given what they don't necessarily want. And the examples which were referred to earlier, like the slum clearance program, there was a genuine desire by the councils to actually improve the living conditions and working conditions and environmental conditions in which people live. But in the drive to provide more houses to rehouse people, I think the listening part seemed to have missed out earlier on. And Walkley community really made their voices heard. What that really led to was, as Veronica said, that the desire, rather than slum clearance program, because it was really bad. When you're in a slum clearance area, no building society, no bank will give you mortgages. You're blighted for life. You can't get anything. Even if people want to invest money, unless they invest 100%, and nobody would invest. Nobody could do it. And that in itself, removal of the slum clearance designation helped a great deal to the local residents in terms of looking at options, whether it's improvement, whether at the end of the day still a demolition one remains to be seen. So clearly the Skeffington report was referred to, which reflected the need for greater public participation in the community, in helping to shape their own destiny, their own aspirations, their own hopes built into a plan called the local plan. And Walkley Netherthorpe District Plan was a vehicle which was used in having a constructive dialogue with the community, Walkley Action Group and others in the process, to try and see how can we reflect their hopes and aspirations into a plan. Of course, we were moving slightly away from slum clearance program, housing-led strategy, to much wider strategic thinking. However, we needed to be focused as well, because clearly people were very concerned in the middle Walkley, which was referred to, and we had to have an action plan for that particular area. Just removing the blight on itself was not the solution. Because when you remove the blight, you still have to follow it through to saying what sort of living conditions will they create. The council then decided, and I was very fortunate to lead the team, a multidisciplinary team, to work with the local residents in the Middle Walkley and create an environmental plan complementary to what Veronica said, that the City Council decided in May 72 to make it a general improvement area. That meant improving houses, but at the same time improving the environment, and improving the environment in a way which the local residents wanted, rather than what somebody else from outside would want. So we had a very good dialogue beginning to build up, and the confidence returned in terms of willingness to talk, discuss, reach an agreement, and even if we agreed to disagree, it was made very clear. The Ruskin Park, which was referred to, was one of the elements that if you're going to revive the area, you must create conditions which are fit for purpose in the 21st century. And Ruskin Park provided that opportunity, as did 6 other urban parks which were created when I was there between 73 and 83. Is the Mount Pleasant Park, some of you will know in Sharrow. You'll know the Ellesmere Park in Ellesmere, Phillimore Park in Darnall, General Cemetery in the Sharrow area. So all round, these urban parks were created to improve the living conditions for people so they can go to the doorstep. And it's for all age groups, young people, children's playground were there, bowling greens were created, adventure playgrounds were created, etc. So, as Veronica then said, that we had 3 general improvement areas in the middle of Walkley, because it was a very large area. Within the planning framework, it was agreed to proceed with those 3, and the multidisciplinary team included people from housing, engineering, planning, town clerk's department, so that nobody can say, I don't agree with it. And it was good to see the change taking place within the town hall to see how we deal with these areas. In other words, an approach for Walkley became a model for a number of other areas. Jeff referred to Sharrow Nether Edge. We had a very active Sharrow Action Group, with a very active Nether Edge neighbourhood group, fighting for different issues. The Sharrow was similar to Walkley. Nether Edge was, there are too many students, too many multiple occupations. We need families here. And we used to have a regular dialogue about this one. That just said, well, the legislation doesn't always permit us to do what you want us to do. But that's a different point, really. We had Burn Grivelsmere Grindstone area. We had an urban theology unit there under Dr. John Vincent, who was a great architect in terms of getting the urban renewal, urban regeneration message across from the local community. We had Darnall. I went to Darnall, and when local people were saying, this is what we want, but can you deliver it? And I was asking Veronica to remind me of the chair of the finance committee who went with me, Councillor Isidore Lewis. He said, Red, how are we going to fund it? I said, if the community wants it, we'll find a way of doing it. If you agree to go along with that. And today they have. And Darnall has enjoyed the public open space that has been provided there. I think what message I'm trying to give you really is, we learned the listening process. People mattered. You work with people rather than for people. And at the end of the day, when you work together, it's likely to be a better solution emerging than if you're working on your own and saying to people, that's what's needed. I think I've probably covered quite a lot, but the final word for me is Walkley 40 years on. A vibrant, stable, functional, and a desirable place to live with a good quality of life. That's what Walkley has become, which is very, very important as such in terms of what it did do. The effort they made was really worth it. And I was very privileged to be part of the process of change which took place in Walkley and beyond. There are a number of examples I could give as the discussion goes on. Anecdotal, how the impact of Walkley has been felt wider in the city. It included areas like City Centre, it has included areas like Lower Don Valley, and so on, but that would be going into detail, but we'll come to that later. I'll leave it probably at there. That's my part of the introduction. But I'll welcome any questions or comments people might have. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much. We'll move straight on to questions, really, I think.